The next item of business is a debate on motion 16531 in the name of Shona Robertson on Scottish Income Tax Rate Resolution 2025-26. I remind members that Rule 11.3.1 requires the question on the Scottish Rate Resolution to be put immediately after the debate, and I'd be grateful if members who wish to speak in the debate were to press their request to speak buttons. And I call on Ivan McKee to speak to and move the motion. I believe that I'm calling on the Cabinet Secretary, Shona Robertson, to speak to and move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before starting, I would like to draw the Parliament's attention to the procedural connection between this debate and Rule 9.16.7 of the Standing Orders, which states that the Scottish Rate Resolution must be agreed before Stage 3 of the Budget Bill is able to proceed. Presiding Officer, this rates resolution debate gives Parliament the opportunity to take one step closer to delivery of a budget that addresses the issues that matter to this country, such as tackling child poverty and improving our NHS. In response to the unprecedented challenges we have faced in recent years, we have raised revenue in a fair and progressive manner that has helped sustain our investment in vital public services. And despite the usual comments from the doomsayers, the Scottish economy remains resilient. Real-time information data for 2022-23 and 23-24 showed earnings growth per head was stronger in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. The Scottish Fiscal Commission 25-26 budget report forecasts real GDP growth of 1.6%. up from 1.3% forecast last year. They also anticipate earnings growing faster than the rest of the UK over the forecast horizons. These figures demonstrate the resilience of the Scottish economy, both now and into the future. Indeed, the 2024 Ernst & Young UK Attractiveness Survey maintains Scotland as the top-performing region of the UK for foreign direct investment projects outside of London for the 9th consecutive year. Presiding Officer, this budget and this rate resolution provides business with the stability they need to continue investing in our economy. It does not contain the unfunded tax policies others in this chamber seem all too happy to advocate. So, first we had the Conservative Party argue for a £595 million income tax cut without setting out which public services they would reduce to pay for it. Now we have the Labour Party saying that they will raise the higher rate threshold to £50,270. We estimate that this change alone would cost over £700 million in 25-26. As the Fraser of Allender pointed out previously, making this change revenue neutral would likely require increases to the basic and intermediate rates of tax. So my challenge to the Labour Party is to set out how they would pay for this. Increase tax for those in the basic and intermediate rates, or simply cut public spending? Those are the questions the Labour Party have to answer. Turning to proposed income tax policy for 2025-26, in the run-up to the publication of our tax strategy, we engaged with 65 different organisations across Scotland, including businesses, think tanks, academics, civil society groups, tax professionals, and we listened to the views of these stakeholders and recognised the importance of certainty after a period of significant changes to our income tax system. Many have welcomed this approach, in particular our commitment to further evaluate the effects of previous changes in Scottish income tax policy. While annual policy will always depend on parliamentary support, we have made clear that we wish to provide a period of stability for income tax for the remainder of this Parliament. Yes.
Smith.
I'm grateful to her giving way. Does she recognise that when it comes to a question of stability, one of the big issues that the Deputy First Minister has been citing recently is the fact that the Scottish tax base is not sufficiently wide, and therefore there is considerable uncertainty as a result of that?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, at the start of my statement, I set out the performance of the Scottish economy, and of course, as allied to the action we are taking to grow the Scottish economy and therefore grow the tax base, is the fact that we have positive net in-migration into Scotland across all tax bands. That is something that we want, of course, to continue to grow that tax base, because we recognise the importance of it. So, in terms of that stability, for the remainder of this Parliament, we do not intend to introduce any new bans or increase the rates of Scottish income tax. We commit to uprating the starter and basic rate bands by at least inflation. We will maintain the higher advanced and top rate thresholds at their current levels, and will continue to deliver on our pledge to protect lower income households, ensuring that more than half of taxpayers pay less than they would elsewhere in the UK for the remainder of this Parliament. As a result of these decisions, the SFC have confirmed that our income tax policy will raise an additional £52 million in 25-26, but in total, the SFC estimate Scotland's income tax policy will raise a record £20.5 billion for the Scottish budget in 2025-26. That's £745 million more than they forecast for the Scottish budget last year. And make no mistake what this means. More money for nurses, GPs, teachers and the police, directly as a result of the decisions we have taken on tax. The average full-time public sector employee in Scotland earned around £1,250 more than the UK average in 2024. And I say to members across this chamber, if you wish to recognise the hard work of Scotland's vital public sector workers, then you'll need to support our income tax policy, which raises the revenue required to agree fair public sector pay settlements. So, in conclusion, let me set out what this means in practical terms. Our progressive approach to income tax policy underpins the entire budget settlement that we've been debating in Parliament this month. It includes continuing to support the most generous social contract in any part of the UK, which includes things like free prescriptions, free higher education and support such as the Scottish Child Payment. It also supports the revitalisation of our NHS by delivering a record £21.7 billion of funding for health and social care, including an increase of £2 billion for frontline NHS boards. And finally, it will enable us to capitalise on new green technologies that will provide future prosperity across the country by funding the expansion of our offshore wind capacity to the tune of £150 million next year. These are just some examples of the investments that the proposed income tax policy set out today supports. And it's important to remind members that these positive changes only go ahead if Parliament votes today's SRR and budget overall. Presiding Officer, the Government is clear on what its priorities are. We're choosing to invest to eradicate child poverty, to grow the economy, to tackle the climate emergency and to provide high-quality and sustainable public services. And that's why I ask members today to vote to ratify the proposed changes to Scottish income tax in 2025-26, and I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Craig Hoy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In 2021, the Scottish Government set out the principles of its approach to taxation: certainty, proportionality, convenience, engagement, effectiveness and efficiency. Now, I would agree that the SNP Government has remained true to some of those principles. There is certainty that this SNP Government will find new ways to tax Scots and tax them more than if they lived in the rest of the UK. But I would challenge ministers as to whether their tax policies are either effective or efficient. Firstly, effective taxes should raise expected revenues and achieve their intended aims. They should also minimise the opportunities for tax avoidance. But any analysis reveals the opposite is taking place in Scotland today, because mounting evidence suggests that there has been behavioural change and that Scotland's high-tax, low-growth economy has in turn impacted earnings growth in Scotland. Presiding Officer, I will give way.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. Would you accept that maybe rather than Scotland having tax that's too high, the UK has tax that is too low, and that is why we have such poor public services?
Craig Hoy.
He can continue in La-La Land and argue that high taxes are a good thing when growth is low, but I think all the evidence would suggest that that is not the case. Presiding Officer, despite the publication of its tax strategy, I still do not believe that the Scottish Government has a handle on how its tax policies have affected Scots' behaviour. In the 24-25 Scottish Budget, the top rate of income tax was increased from 47% to 48%. The Scottish Fiscal Commission projected that the revenue raised in 24-25 would have been £53 million from that, but instead they then went on to estimate that the net amount was likely to be around £8 million once behavioural responses were factored in. The risk is that people will be working less hours, retiring earlier, and certainly some are moving away or are not moving here at all. I will take an intervention on that point.
I mean, he keeps making this point about we don't have information on behavioural change, and then he goes on to quote a whole raft of information about behavioural change. Well, he's making his mind up.
Craig Hoy.
What I'm saying is the government does not have the evidence that it likes to support the fact that there isn't behavioural change. And I'll give it here, because earlier this year, Scottish Financial Enterprise research found that 81% of its members were concerned about the impacts of tax divergence on retaining staff, with 66% saying the changes in the tax regime had harmed investment. There is independent research from an independent organisation. Now, others are also concerned that there are people in Scotland now who are incorporating to avoid the SNP's high tax regime, and that the proceeds of that incorporation, the taxes, are now being paid to the UK Treasury rather than to the Scottish Government. These are the direct consequences of the SNP's high tax regime. We also need to look at the SNP government's tax decisions and the impact that these have had on the wider performance of the Scottish economy. Audit Scotland said in January that whilst income tax revenues are continuing to rise, I concede that point, the impact on the Scottish budget is significantly reduced by relatively slower economic growth in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. This is in part because of higher tax, which in itself, and alongside the other SNP's policies, is making Scotland a less attractive place to work, invest or to grow. Because between 2017 and 2022, Scottish taxpayers paid an additional £3.4 billion as a result of devolved tax policy differences here in Scotland. However, slower economic growth in Scotland meant that the net benefit to the budget over the same period is a much lower £629 million, something I raised with the First Minister today, who had no answer. But this leads Audit Scotland to warn, and I quote, "This current economic performance gap underlines the importance of relative economic growth to Scotland's public finances and should be a key area of focus for the Scottish Government in the coming years." And we don't see enough in this budget to see that the Government is going to make work in relation to this. Presiding Officer, this week the Cabinet Secretary sidestepped a question from me as to whether the SNP's complex set of income tax rates leads to higher compliance costs, but everyone, I think, can see that it clearly does. Now, other than trying to grab meaningless headlines about whether or not there are fewer people are paying lower tax in Scotland or not, regardless of how much they are actually paying less, there is really no rational or economic case for a tax structure being more complex than the rest of the UK. We now have a personal allowance, a starter rate, a basic rate, an intermediate rate, a higher rate, an advanced rate and a top rate. This compares to the basic, higher and additional rates for the rest of the UK. Our rates are higher at the top end, 48% here, rather than 45% in England. And at the mid and upper levels, it's 42% and 45%, rather than the simple 40% south of the border. If I could get the time back, Presiding Officer, I'd happily give way. Okay, I'll happily give way.
Ross Greer.
Thank you. I'm grateful to Mr Hoy for taking the intervention. He was present at the Finance Committee meeting where I asked the Institute for Fiscal Studies about their view on this alleged complication that is caused by Scotland having more income tax bands by the rest of the UK. And the evidence back was that there is no evidence of negative effects from us having more tax bands. I can understand why the Conservatives don't want those on higher incomes to pay more. But could Mr Hoy please explain exactly what he thinks the harms are by having more tax bands? Because the Institute for Fiscal Studies couldn't find any evidence of that.
Craig Hoy.
I think if you speak to accountants in the Chartered Institute, you will understand that they're saying there are compliance costs from this additionally complex and also flawed tax system, given that it isn't bringing in what the Scottish Government hoped it would do. Now, the reality is that for somebody earning £50,000 in the UK, they're now paying £1,500 more in tax, and someone lucky enough to earn £100,000, like ministers on the front bench, are paying £3,300 in additional tax. But the SNP's high taxes don't just fall on high earners anymore. They also fall on nurses, teachers and police officers. Now, it's quite clear in our budget submission that we would like to see taxes reduced on ordinary Scots. And in the budget, we called for the abolition of rates to give a tax cut to hard-working Scots. This would also, our recommendations would also have made Scotland a more competitive place on tax at the mid-levels than the rest of the UK. But it is clear that ministers are on a different path. It's one of high tax and low growth. But not only do the SNP's tax plans that we are debating today contradict the very principles that they set out in 2021, they will also mean that more people will be paying more tax in Scotland. This will undoubtedly hamper growth and undermine competitiveness, and it is for these reasons that we will not support the Scottish Rate Resolution after this debate.
Thank you, Mr Hoy. I now call on Michael Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Rule 9.16.7 of Standing Orders dictates that Parliament must agree to a resolution before Stage 3 proceedings of the Budget Bill can begin. As such, Scottish Labour will support the rate resolution this afternoon. With an additional £5.2 billion added to Scotland's budget, this is the largest budget in the history of devolution. And it's only possible because of decisions taken by the UK Labour Government both to raise revenue and invest in public services. So we will not stand in the way of this budget because we want Labour's record investment to have a chance of reaching the front line of public services. This is a Scottish budget that corrects some of the most egregious and most recent of SNP mistakes, rather than seizing the opportunity to transform Scotland's public services and set a new direction for our country. Far too much of it is more of the same from the SNP. More of the same won't deliver, I'm afraid, more NHS appointments or cut waiting times. More of the same won't improve attainment in schools or solve the funding crisis that's besetting our higher education sector. There is none of the reform, not at the moment, thank you, there is none of the reform required to improve our public services and bring real change to communities across Scotland. While a UK Labour government this week delivered an extra 2 million NHS appointments ahead of schedule, Scotland's NHS remains in perpetual crisis and without intervention, terminal decline. No, sir, I won't. To spend money on public services, you first have to raise it, Presiding Officer. Today's resolution will achieve a portion of that, but the lion's share comes from the decisions taken by the Chancellor. Having opposed every revenue-raising measure proposed by the Labour government, the First Minister suggested the UK government should have raised income tax in England. Surely the man who negotiated the fiscal framework should know that that would have slashed Scotland's budget. He was promptly slapped down, Presiding Officer, by the Fraser of Allender Institute, who said, and I quote, "Since the start of the year, the First Minister, John Swinney, has been making the case that the UK Government had alternatives for raising revenue. For example, they could have followed the Scottish Government's example to raise income tax." They go on. So if the UK Government had increased income tax, the deduction to the block grant would be larger and the Scottish budget would be worse off. They calculate, Presiding Officer, that his proposal would have cut Scotland's budget by £636 million. Certainly.
Cabinet Secretary.
On the point of cutting budgets, can Michael Mara explain the policy set out by his leader Anna Sarwar to raise the higher rate threshold to £50,270, which would cost over £700 million? How is he going to pay for that? Spending cuts or an increase to the basic and intermediate rates of tax?
Michael Mara.
Thank you, President. I appreciate the intervention of the Cabinet Secretary. I think it's a very legitimate aspiration to try and simplify the taxes, to try and simplify, if I can, Cabinet Secretary, if I can explain to you, if there's a very legitimate aspiration to try and simplify the system, we know that the vast bulk of tax rises and tax revenue that's come through the government's approach has come through fiscal drag and the people between £40,000 and £50,000. They are paying ever more and getting ever less from this government. So it's an entirely legitimate aspiration to look to grow our economy and make sure that we can address that issue. So despite telling the Parliament's Finance Committee that she agreed with the First Minister, the Finance Secretary could not propose one specific alternative in which the UK Government could have raised revenue this year to fund the budget. No constructive suggestions, no new ideas. Scotland deserves much better than this tired government who have lost their way. Scotland needs fresh ideas and a new direction.
Thank you, Mr Mara. I now call on Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland has the most progressive system of income tax anywhere in the UK. I'm proud of that, and I think we should all be proud of that. Most people here pay a little bit less, those on higher incomes pay more, and this year alone that will raise £1.7 billion for our public services. That funds everything from free bus travel for young people to the Scottish Child Payment to the baby box, policies unique to Scotland that are making a transformational impact in the lives of people across the country, especially our most vulnerable families. And I'm proud that it was the Scottish Greens who delivered the major changes to income tax since the point at which it was devolved. And yes, there's a bit more that can be done in changing our income tax system to make it that bit more progressive. Not a great deal more, certainly not in terms of revenue yield. But income is far from the whole picture here. Of course, the wealthiest people in this country manage their finances in such a way that regular income plays only a very small part in it. And income taxes do not tackle generational wealth inequality. Property is the obvious area to address wealth inequality through in terms of the devolved powers available to us. So I am glad that we have just once again increased the additional dwelling supplement paid by those who are in the fortunate enough position to be purchasing a home that's not their primary property, generally second or holiday homes or buy-to-let landlords. But of course the main property tax that we have available in Scotland is the council tax, a system that is totally broken, something that we all agree on, a system that has not been in date since years before I was born, almost a decade before this Parliament was established was the last time that council tax was based on accurate valuations. And the Cabinet Secretary was very honest to the Finance Committee this week about the challenges to achieving council tax reform, preferably replacement, or even just to revaluation. And it is the politics of it, that any major change to our tax system would have winners and losers. And as I pointed out on Tuesday, given how grossly unequal the council tax system is at the moment, any winners from a change would likely be those on lower incomes, in smaller value properties, etc., depending on what we change it to. And the losers would be those currently residing in much higher value, generally much larger properties, the wealthier people in our society, those who have much more political and social capital to cause grief for governments and political parties who do decide to make that change. But I am proud of the changes that we have made, the small tweaks that we've made to that system. So, for example, the Greens secured a doubling of council tax on second and holiday homes. And the Scottish Government consulted on going further than that doubling. In Wales, of course, it can be up to 300% that's charged on a second or a holiday home. And there was overwhelming public support for that. So I will be bringing amendments to the housing bill to give councils the power to set whatever rate of council tax they wish for those second and holiday homes. This is a decision that should be for them to make, not for us to make in this Parliament when it comes to a local tax like that. There are new tools that either have been introduced or that will be introduced, like the visitor levy and the cruise ship levy, that will also empower local government, also secured by the Greens. But we do collectively need to grasp this thistle. It is incredibly frustrating to have the same debates about council tax reform over and over again without that substantial change being made, where we retreat from that point of even just revaluation. No significant reform can take place without accurate data. Surely we can all agree on a revaluation exercise being a necessity towards the end of this parliamentary term and into the next one. Presiding Officer, we need to tackle the big challenges that face this country: the climate emergency, child poverty, our ageing population and the social care and health demands that come with it. Every single one of those costs money, costs a substantial amount of money. But doing nothing costs far more. We need to be honest about where that money comes from. I am proud that in this country we have taken the decision over and over again to make sure that those with the broadest shoulders bear the greatest responsibility for funding the public services that deliver and that meet the needs of the people of Scotland.
Thank you, Mr Greer. I now call Willie Rennie.
Actually, just to carry on from where Ross Greer finished, there's been much spoken about the progressive nature of the taxation system, and that has been the feature of budgets for some years now. John Swinney, when he was last Finance Secretary, when he stepped in for Kate Forbes, made a slightly different argument at that point. He said the situation was extraordinary. There was an emergency. It was just post-COVID. We were dealing with some real deep financial problems. And he said that required an emergency rise in the tax. Now, I asked at that point, when the emergency is over, does that mean the tax goes back down again? And he was reluctant to plan future budgets, as he put it at the time. But as we've seen, these increases have been embedded into the budget. So it wasn't really an extraordinary emergency situation at that point. It was another means to raise taxation. And then Hamza Yousaf took over and all went wild at that point, and he was talking about ever greater progressivity in the tax system, egged on by the Green Party. And that's a valid point of view to have. But the problem is that it broke trust with the public. They didn't really know where the government was going with this progressive taxation. And when you break trust on taxation, it is invidious. It creates real difficulties with people making individual choices about their behaviour. And I'm not talking about leaving the country. I'm talking about individual behavioural changes in terms of how they work, early retirement, going part-time, moving over to corporation status. There's all sorts of different ways. And we've seen there has been an effect of behavioural change. In part, not because of individual budget decisions that are taken. People can live with individual decisions. It's the cumulative effect over a period of time and the uncertainty that is caused by the rhetoric that goes with this. And that was certainly the case with Hamza Yousaf. Now, we proposed a tax rise in 2016, but the difference was it was a penny for a purpose, for education. It was defined, and we said that was it. We didn't say it was going to go on forever as a progressive campaign over a number of years. We said it was defined. And we believed under that method we would retain public confidence. The people I do worry about in terms of behavioural change are people like NHS consultants who can be mobile and they can make a decision at certain points in their career to leave the country, to go down south, to go elsewhere because of better taxation systems. They're not going to decide in the middle of a contract. Can I just finish this point? They're not going to go in the middle of a contract to choose to go somewhere else. But the pressure is there, combined with all the other pressures that exist in the system. Yes.
Cabinet Secretary.
I appreciate Willie Rennie raising the need for competitiveness for our consultants and our wider NHS staff. Does he appreciate the pay deal that was secured last year that meant that we do have competitiveness turning for consultants, and actually for the majority of healthcare staff in Scotland they are paid more than their counterparts anywhere else in the UK?
Willie Rennie.
Reinforces the point that we're having to have a system of plugging the holes caused by other parts of government policy. And that's where we need to be careful, because we're not just talking about NHS consultants. Are we going to plug the holes all across those critical people that we require to run the economy or health services or education systems? Of course we're not going to do that, because that would undermine the whole purpose of the taxation system. But I recognise the point he's making. But it proves, I think, my point, is we need to have a tax system that people trust, that's got long-lasting effects that people believe in and therefore don't actually change their behaviour as a result. Now, we're going to be supporting the tax resolution, having said all of that. We're going to be supporting because we believe we need to get people paid, we need to get the tax raised. It's an essential part of the process. And we have negotiated, we think, a pretty good deal in the budget process for GPs, for dentists, for long COVID, on housing, hospices, drugs, careers. The list goes on for a long time. And we think it's a good deal, and therefore we'll vote for the budget. But the tax resolution itself is at least stable, and the fact that the Finance Secretary indicated that that stability is going to last for the remainder of the Parliament is a good thing too. But these debates, if I can just conclude on this point, Presiding Officer, these debates are very different from what they used to be. Because we used to debate in this Parliament how we were just going to spend money rather than how we were going to raise it. And that has changed the nature of these debates, I think, for a far better debate and a far better Parliament. We are thinking about the effects on people's pockets and the effects on investment in public services at the same time, and that's a good thing.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. And I now call on Ivan McKee to wind up. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, President Officer. I just want to pick up on the final point that Willie Rennie made, because I think it's an important point. And he maybe doesn't realise the full implications of it, because he's absolutely right. This Parliament's moved from just talking about spending to now talking about raising revenue, and it has require more and more of the powers of an independent state. And as we continue down that journey towards full independence, I'm sure he'll join with me in welcoming this Parliament's ability to talk about all of those issues that affect an independent state. Yeah.
Willie Rennie.
The Minister will know you can stop at times.
Minister.
Just the enthusiasm and momentum behind Willie Rennie's dialogue. I was sure he was on that journey with us. Presiding Officer, today Parliament's been asked to vote on a policy that will raise much needed revenues for public services, while continuing to see the majority of taxpayers in Scotland pay less than if they lived elsewhere in the UK. Analysis shows that on average households in the lower half of income distribution are £450 a year better off than they would be south of the border when considering both their tax and social security policies. The SFC estimate our income tax policy will bring in an extra £20.5 billion for the Scottish budget. We'll bring in, £20.5 billion for the Scottish budget in 25-26, £745 million more than the forecast for 25-26 at the Scottish budget last year. We heard the business community loud and clear during our tax strategy engagement when they asked for greater certainty and no further increases to income tax, and that is what this budget delivers. It's a proposal constructed in a balanced way, one that provides a period of income tax stability for taxpayers, while allowing businesses to invest in a growing economy in Scotland. And that point about a growing economy is important, because we hear some of the naysayers in here talk down Scotland's economy. The last available data, annualised basis, Scotland's economy growing at 1.2%, higher than the 1.0% across the rest of the UK. Scotland's unemployment at 3.8%, lower than the 4.4% across the rest of the UK. Inward investment into Scotland again higher for the 9th year in a row than every other part of the UK outside of London. Scotland's economy is not doing as well as it could do, but it's doing better at the moment than the economy of the rest of the UK. Our approach ensures that we can continue to support our vital public services. I don't know if I've got time. Ross Greer.
Ross Greer.
Thank you. I was wondering if the Minister would agree with me that the response to those in this Parliament who demand that we widen the tax base and by implication take people who are on social security and out of work into work, that the solution to that is not to slash their social security payments, it's to provide them with the employment training and support required to get them into the workplace if they so wish, and that costs money, money that we need to raise through this progressive tax system.
Minister.
Ross Greer makes a very valid point. Of course, we want to get as many people into the economy working as we can and provide them with the skills to contribute to fill the many gaps that there are in skills, and Scotland's economy continues to grow and create those opportunities. So, as I said, our approach ensures that we can continue to support vital services like the ones that Ross Greer mentioned that provide the most generous public service offering available in any part of the UK, ensuring Scotland remains a great place to live, work, study and do business. And we contrast that with almost £600 million in tax cuts the Tories would call for, which would directly impact our ability to provide those services. And the £700 million, as my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary, has just highlighted, that Labour wants to take out of the availability for public spending within Scotland through their hastily back of an envelope cobbled together plans on what passes for their income tax policy. So this funding allows the Scottish economy to regain momentum and prosper after the years of COVID and challenges from Brexit, one that will support continued renewal of our NHS for allowing us to seize the opportunities of the green energy transition. So I hope that members will vote positively for this motion. I welcome those who have already indicated that they will do so, including, it appears, the Labour Party, and I lost a small wager with my colleague to my left on trying to decide how Labour might vote this afternoon. But I suppose the inconsistency around Labour voting for the tax policy but not voting for the budget does seem a bit typical of their muddled positioning at this point in time. Presiding Officer, this budget chooses a path of stability in our income tax choices to provide certainty for our taxpayers, take-home pay after years of high inflation, certainty for our businesses after the damage of EU exit and insecurities facing the world economy, and certainty for our public services with record investment. And encourage all members to support this motion. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on Scottish Income Tax Rate Resolution 2025 to 2026. It's now time to move to the question on the motion. And the question is that motion 16531 in the name of Shona Robertson on Scottish Income Tax Rate Resolution 2025 to 26 be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system.